Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. On September the 4th, 1970, presidential elections, or rather their direct stage, were held in Chile, Latin America, or more specifically South America's western or Pacific coast. The elections were very close. There were three candidates. The ruling Christian Democrats fielded Radomiro Tomic or Tomic. The nationalists allied with dissident Christian Democrats, radicals, and fielded Senator Salvador Allende. This was Allende's fourth presidential candidacy. In 19 he over 5% of the vote. In 1958, he had got over 30% or 31%, or at least over a quarter of the vote. In 1964, he had obtained his highest score, over 38%, but he had lost all those three elections. In 1958 to Alessandri, in 1964 to Christian Democrat Eduardo Frei, who had promised una revolución en la libertad, a revolution in freedom. And various socio-economic reforms had been undertaken. The problem was that the right-wing nationalists generally felt that the Christian Democrats were going somewhat too far, while many socialists and especially communists felt that they were not going far enough with those reforms. Allende, originally a medical doctor, had entered public office in 1938 when he had been appointed Minister of Health and Social Welfare, in which post he had served until 1942. In 1945, he had been elected to the Chilean Senate and had been re-elected in 1953, 1961, and 1969. He had even served as the president or chairperson of the Senate from 1966 until 1969. Once he had joked that his tombstone would contain the epitaph, "Here lies the next president of Chile." But he did take his presidential candidacy seriously in 1970, and he was just able to defeat Mr. Alessandri, with 36.6% of the vote going to Allende, 35.3% to Alessandri, and the remaining 28.1% to Tomic or Tomic. In other words, the Chilean electorate in that election was almost evenly divided into three camps: the left-wing camp supporting Allende, the right-wing camp supporting Alessandri, and the centrist camp supporting Tomic. After the 1969 Chilean parliamentary elections, the Christian Democrats had lost their absolute majority. However, they still held the largest number of seats in both the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house, and the Senate, the upper house. Therefore, Allende knew that in order to win, because the Chilean constitution at the time did not allow the people to elect one of the two top candidates if no candidate got over 50% of the vote on the first round. Rather, it was the duty of the members of Congress in those cases to elect the president. And several weeks later, in late October 1970, despite pressure, including bribery, applied on various members of the Chilean Congress by agents of the Central Intelligence Agency, on the orders of then US President Richard Nixon, who considered Allende as a Marxist socialist too far to the left and likely to become another left-wing dictator, similar to Fidel Castro, who indeed was a good friend of Allende and would indeed spend 1 month in Chile in 1971. However, when the vote was taken, Allende was the clear winner, with 153 members of the Chilean Congress supporting him, only 35 voting for Alessandri, the rest abstaining or not present. However, the victory did not come for free. The Christian Democrats, in return for their support for Allende, which sealed his victory, made him sign an accord of constitutional guarantees where he promised to uphold democracy in the rule and the rule of law in Chile despite his planned socialist reforms. He took office as the new Chilean president in November 1970. I've seen more than once a video clip of his supporters chanting Allende, Allende, uh, as he was being as he greeted the crowds from the balcony of the presidential palace, La Moneda, and also, if I remember correctly, as he was being driven through the central street of Santiago de Chile, the country's capital, in a car. So he proceeded to increase considerably the education, health, and social welfare budgets. Initially, he was able to have an informal coalition with the centrist Christian Democrats. He also raised the wages even when inflation was taken into account by 50%. He proceeded to nationalize Chile's copper industry, or at least a part of it. For the first year or so of his truncated presidency, things seemed to go quite well. However, he declared already in December 1971, having been in office only for 13 months, and as it turned out, with a foreshadow of what was to come, that only if he was riddled with bullets, in other words, assassinated, would he not complete his 6-year term as president. Nowadays, the Chilean constitution is different. There is a 2-round system in the presidential elections. So if no candidate wins over 50% of the vote on the first round, there's a second round held weeks later between the two top candidates. The president can serve 4 years at a time, and then after waiting for the next 4 years, he or she can then run again for president as a former president. During 1972, inflation began to massively increase. There were strikes, and Allende, on at least 1 or 2 occasions, even urged his supporters to take over certain industrial plants, if I remember correctly. Despite these problems in the parliamentary elections, because of course inflation hurt especially those people with the lowest incomes and with fixed incomes, like pensioners and students. But despite these problems in the so-called midterm parliamentary elections that were held in March 1973, Allende's supporters, the left-wing coalition or central-left coalition known as La Unidad Popular, the People's Unity, was able to actually gain some more seats in the Chilean. This was important because the opposition, by then consisting of the nationalists and Christian Democrats, was starting to consider an impeachment vote, which would then force Allende to resign. And one of the reasons for the impeachment vote proposal was the fact that he had started to rule partly by decree, because many of his socioeconomic reform proposals had been watered down or rejected by the Congress, and so he decided to use this controversial power, which had been instituted by a very briefly serving, already deceased Chilean president. Chile had been a democracy remarkably long by the Latin American standards during that set of democratic rule since 1932. And Allende's Chile definitely was no police state. There was constant criticism of Allende in the mass media, including the press, and the television. There were many demonstrations against him. But despite that, his core constituency, especially the working classes and a portion of the farmers, portion of the intellectuals and students, remained reasonably loyal. However, on June the 29th, 1973, there was the so-called tanquetazo, or an attempt to force him to resign by surrounding the presidential palace, La Moneda, with tanks or armored vehicles. However, one of the most senior army officers of Chile stood there outside the presidential palace and was able to persuade the rebellious soldiers to abort their coup attempt. In August 1973, the Chilean Chamber of Deputies passed a resolution condemning Allende for unconstitutional measures undertaken during his presidency. However, the resolution lacked the two-thirds majority to force Allende into an impeachment trial in the Senate. Allende, in his written reply, called the vote a politically motivated one. It was tragic that shortly before, just days before Allende's election had been confirmed by the Chilean Congress in late October 1970, one of the leading Chilean generals, Carlos Schneider, if I remember his name correctly, had been shot fatally in an ambush. He was a firm proponent of the army's duty to remain loyal to whoever was the president and to stay out of politics. And it was tragic that Allende, just weeks before his own overthrow and suicide, appointed a right-wing secretly rebellious General Augusto Pinochet as the army's commander-in-chief. In retrospect, that was one of his biggest mistakes, because this commandership gave General Pinochet access to officers and other rebellious right-wing groups. And on the morning of September the 11th, 1973, in the northwestern Chilean city of Valparaiso, over 100 kilometers to the northwest of Santiago, an insurrection rebellion broke out. During that morning, Salvador Allende, who had left the presidential residence, and his wife, Mrs. Hortensia Bussi, for the last time, as it turned out, gave 6 brief speeches on live radio, including then his emotional farewell speech, where he declared that the government was legal, and already in the second or third of these 6 brief radio addresses, he declared that he would not resign. And already he referred to the possibility that he could die, but he refused to resign, even if it would cost his life. And in his famous farewell speech, he said, "I am not going to resign. Caught in a moment of historical transition, I will pay with my life the loyalty of people." Of course, by the people, he meant his supporters. And he indeed emotionally and admiringly spoke of them. And he declared in his final radioed moments that despite this coup, the historical processes could not be stopped, and that sooner or later the Chilean people would rise up and the forces of social justice would prevail. Finally, after 1 p.m., maybe around 1:30 p.m. on that fateful day, with a large section of La Moneda, the presidential palace, on fire and bombed, damaged, he told his remaining supporters to give up. They then formed a line which stretched all the way to the bottom of the stairs, leading to the presidential palace. And he personally shook hands with each one of them. After having shaken hands, he returned inside the palace and he went to, I think, the Independence Hall. And one of his remaining supporters just had enough time to see how the president shot himself in the head with his AK-47 rifle, which was a gift from Fidel Castro, with the inscription, "To my good friend Salvador, who tries by different means to achieve the same goals." In other words, the same socialist left-wing goals. He was determined not to be captured or abused, and indeed, according to a historical book I've read, I think Historic Assassinations, there were various humiliations that the coup leaders, including General Pinochet, had planned for President Allende. Earlier that day, he also had refused the offer of a safe passage by airplane. Although there have been reports, and I think I've read on one historical website at least, that the offer of a safe passage by airplane may have been a hoax, and that flight might have ended in a crash, which of course would then have killed by then deposed President Allende. So let's look at his life a bit more in detail. He was born on June the 26th, 1908, also in Santiago, the Chilean capital, and committed suicide, as was confirmed 38 years later by his autopsy on September the 11th, 1973. He was Latin America's first democratically and peacefully elected Marxist president. Note, he was a socialist, economically a Marxist. However, he believed in a multi-party democracy. He believed in the freedom of speech, mass media, religion, and democratically, not by force as Fidel Castro in Cuba. He was of Basque. The Basque people are remnants of a small nation living in northern Spain and southwestern France, and Belgian or Walloons descent. He attended high school at Instituto Nacional General José Miguel Carrera of Santiago and at the Liceo Eduardo de la Barra in Valparaiso. He was a talented athlete in his youth. Said to have excelled at the long jump. He graduated with a medical degree in 1933 from the University of Chile. During his time at medical school, Allende was influenced by Professor Max Westenhofer, a German pathologist who emphasized the social determinants of disease and social medicine. He co-founded a section of the Socialist Party of Chile and became its chairman. He married Hortensia Bussi and had 3 daughters with her. He was a Freemason. In 1933, he published his doctoral thesis, Higiene Mental y Delinquencia, Crime and Mental Hygiene, in which he criticized Cesare Lombroso's proposals. In 1938, he was in charge of the electoral campaign of the Popular Front headed by Pedro Aguirre Cerda. The Popular Front's slogan was bread, a roof, and work. In the 1950s, he introduced legislation in the Chilean Senate that established the Chilean National Health Service, the first program in the Americas to guarantee universal healthcare at the national level. Already from 1962 to 1964, the CIA spent a total of $2.6 million of that time to finance the campaign of Eduardo Frei and spent $3 million in anti-Allende propaganda to scare voters away from Allende's left-wing coalition. Allende had a close relationship with the Chilean Communist Party, and indeed, on his fourth and successful bid for the presidency, the Communist Party supported him as the alternate for its own candidate to the world-renowned poet, Mr. Pablo Neruda. During his brief presidential term, according to this Wikipedia article, Allende shared positions held by the communists in opposition to the views of the socialists. However, some argued that this was reversed at the end of his period in office. Indeed, shortly before he was overthrown and committed suicide, he proposed the holding of a plebiscite, a referendum where the adult Chilean voters could take part on whether they wanted him to continue in office and continue his reforms or not. Yeah, it was René Schneider who was fatally wounded on October the 20th, 1970, and who died of his wounds on October the 23rd. And already on the following day, the Congress ratified Allende's election victory by voting for him. So during his brief presidency, Allende had time to nationalize large-scale industries, especially copper mining and banking. And then he increased, as I said, the healthcare, educational, and social welfare budgets. He provided a program of free milk for children in the schools and shantytowns of Chile, and an expansion of the original Christian Democratic Land Seizure and Redistribution program. In November 1970, the month when he took office as the Chilean president, 3,000 scholarships were allocated to Mapuche children in an effort to integrate the indigenous or native minority into the educational system. There was also an emergency plan providing for the construction of 120,000 residential buildings. Chile's inflation rate fell from 36.1% in 1970, so meaning about 3% per month, to 22.1% in 1971, so just under 2% per month, while average real wages rose by 22.3% during 1971. And during the first quarter of 1971, meaning from January to March, the minimum real wages for blue-collar workers were increased by 56%, while the real minimum wages for white-collar workers were increased by 23%. So the differential ratio between the blue and white-collar workers' minimum wages decreased from 49% in 1970 to 35% in 1971. Central government expenditures went up by 36% in real terms. 76,000 new houses were built in 1971 alone. The new agriculture minister, Jacques Chonchol, promised to expropriate, or to take over to the public sector's possession all estates which were larger than 80 basic hectares. This promise was kept, and no farm in Chile exceeded this limit by the end of 1972. Illiteracy quite considerably decreased during Allende's brief presidency. He also funded a number of cultural and artistic endeavors. And he believed in gender equality, establishing the Women's Secretariat in 1971, dealing with, for example, public laundry facilities, public food programs, daycare centers, and women's healthcare, especially prenatal or pre-birth care. The maternity leave was extended from 6 to 12 weeks. Minimum pensions were increased by amounts equal to 2 or 3 times the inflation rate. And between 1970 and 1972, such pensions increased by a total of 550%. 550%. In 1971, Chile re-established diplomatic relations with the communist Cuba, joining Mexico and Canada in rejecting a previously established Organization of American States Convention prohibiting governments in the Western Hemisphere from establishing diplomatic relations with Cuba. In October 1972, so 11 months before Allende's overthrow and suicide, the first of what were to be a wave of strikes was led first by truckers and later by small businessmen, some mostly professional unions and some student groups. Eventually, the Chilean appeals court declared Allende's actions illegal, and the government was ordered to return trucks to their owners, because Allende had instructed the government to begin requisitioning trucks to keep the nation from coming to a halt. Government supporters also had helped to mobilize trucks and buses, but violence served as a deterrent to full mobilization, even with police protection for the strike breakers. Export income fell due to a hard-hit copper industry. Copper's price on international markets fell by almost a third, and post-nationalization copper production also fell. In 1972, Chile's inflation rose to 150%, which then meant, let's calculate it soon, 12.5% per month. Chile gained commitments from the Soviet Union to invest some $400 million in Chile in the next 6 years. However, Allende's government had hoped for much bigger assistance from the United States. During Nixon's presidency, which was partly concurrent with Allende's, Nixon had taken office in January 1969 and was forced to resign under the threat of impeachment in August 1974. United States officials attempted to prevent Allende's election by financing political parties aligned with opposition candidate Jorge Alessandri and supporting strikes in the mining and transportation sectors. The most prominent U.S. corporations in Chile before Allende's presidency were the Anaconda and Kennecott Copper Companies and ITT Corporation, International Telephone and Telegraph. After General Pinochet assumed power in September 1973, U.S. Secretary of State or Foreign Minister Henry Kissinger told President Richard Nixon that the United States didn't do it, in other words, commit the coup, but we helped them, in other words, these right-wing elements hostile to Allende, create the conditions as great as possible. Political and moral support for President Allende came mostly through the Communist Party and the Soviet Union's trade unions. For instance, Allende received the Lenin Peace Prize from the Soviet Union in 1972. For months, and rightly so, as it turned out, Allende had feared calling upon the Carabineros, the national police force, suspecting them of disloyalty to his government. And indeed, uh, some tens of police officers left the presidential palace during the last hours of Allende's presidency and life. On August the 9th, so just over a month before his overthrow, August the 9th, 1973, President Allende appointed General Carlos Prats as Minister of Defense. And tragically, on August the 24th, 1973, so only 2.5 weeks before the coup, General Prats was forced to resign both as defense minister and as the Chilean army's commander-in-chief, embarrassed by both the Alejandrina Cox incident and a public protest in front of his house by his generals' wives. And Allende, very mistakenly as it turned out, appointed General Augusto Pinochet, the man who would lead the coup against him just 2.5 weeks later, as the new Chilean army commander-in-chief. Already on May the 26th, 1973, so just over a month before the so-called Tanquetazo coup attempt, which failed, the Chilean Supreme Court had unanimously denounced the Allende government's disruption of the nation's legality in its failure to uphold judicial decisions because of its continual refusal to permit police execution of judicial decisions contrary to the Chilean government's own measures. And this impeachment resolution, which failed to gain the 2/3 majority necessary to start the impeachment trial, the vote was 81 in favor to 47 against, was taken on August the 22nd, 1973. The Christian Democrats and nationalists accused Allende's government of the following offenses: ruling by decree, thwarting the normal legislative system, refusing to enforce judicial decisions against its partisans, and not carrying out sentences and judicial resolutions that contravene its objectives, ignoring the independent general comptroller's office's decrees, various media offenses, such as taking control or seizing control of the national television network and applying economic pressure against those media organizations that were not the government's unconditional supporters, allowing its socialist supporters to assemble with arms and preventing the same by its right-wing opponents, supporting over 1,500 illegal takeovers of farms, illegal repression of the El Teniente miners' strike, and illegally limiting immigration. Allende replied on August the 24th, 1973, characterizing the declaration as destined to damage Chile's prestige abroad and create internal confusion, predicting that it would facilitate certain sectors' seditious or rebellious intention. He wrote, "Chilean democracy is a conquest by all of the people. It is neither the work nor the gift of the exploiting classes, and it will be defended by those who with sacrifices accumulated over generations have imposed it. With a tranquil conscience, I sustain that never before has Chile had a more democratic government than that over which I have the honor to preside. I solemnly reiterate my decision to develop democracy and a state of law to their consequences. Congress has made itself a bastion against the transformations and has done everything it can to perturb or disturb the functioning of the finances and of the institutions, sterilizing all creative initiatives." A quote from his dramatic farewell speech on live radio broadcast: "Workers of my country, I have faith in Chile and its destiny. Other men will overcome this dark and bitter moment when treason seeks to prevail. Keep in mind that much sooner than later, the great avenues will again be opened through which will pass free men to construct a better society. Long live Chile, long live the people, long live the workers." Well-known relatives of Salvador Allende include his daughter Isabel Allende Bussi, a politician and a writer. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. So she's a politician, while his first cousin, once removed, Isabel Allende Yona, is a writer. In front of the Chilean presidential palace, El Palacio de la Moneda, there is a statue of Allende. He's buried in Santiago's Central Cemetery, and his tomb is a major tourist attraction. A residential street in Toronto, Canada has been named after him. In Nicaragua, Central America, the tourist port of Managua is named after him. There's a square named after him in Vila de Cans near Barcelona in Spain, called Plaza de Salvador Allende, or Salvador Allende Square. There is an avenue, Salvador Allende Straße, or street, a nearby bridge in Berlin, Germany's capital. There's a park in Budapest, Hungary, or Hungary's capital, named for him. There is a park in La Spezia in Italy, named for Allende, and there's a street in Szekszárd, Hungary, also named for Allende.